Hi, everyone, and welcome to our Social Security Work and School in the Context of Psychosis training. I will turn it over to our presenters to introduce themselves.
Thank you all for being here. It's a few of you I know, most of you I don't. All three of us are actually here, myself, Howard, and Shannon. Yeah, just to get started, I think actually before we in a sense introduce ourselves, just to be kind of fully transparent, we will be kind of talking about a research project that we'll be doing in California. And so we'll kind of circle back to this at the end. But just so you grasp the connection, it's entirely about really understanding young people's experiences in terms of decisions and supports related to education, work, and disability benefits. In terms of me, I am a professor in the School of Social Work at the University of Pittsburgh, mental health services researcher, lived in California for quite a while and did early psychosis work in California. I also worked for the OAC there and lived in Sacramento. So lots of kind of familiarity and context with California, but now in Pennsylvania. And I, for those of you who don't know me, kind of started out in this space as a client in early coordinated specialty care program in Chicago. And really kind of ever since I emerged from that have been doing work in the early psychosis space, eventually including research once I got back into school. Really briefly, I think kind of both Shannon and I will just kind of give you a little bit of information here, context about our own backgrounds. In my case, when I was first diagnosed with schizophrenia, I was then identified as a threat by my college campus and first just sort of removed from campus and placed on involuntary leave. And then I was eventually allowed to return, but was eventually terminated from my entire program. And told in the process that somebody like me had no prospects of ever being able to repay their student loans, and that was therefore a reason for barring me from even taking college classes. This was not that long ago, although I, hope that things have that the dial has moved just a little bit. So in terms of education, work, and employment, and then in the context of my CSC program, right? Then I was unemployed and out of school and doing very badly. And so the program, of course, thought that I should apply for SSI. And in some sense, those experiences are the origins of this project and the origins of a lot of focus on kind of what is happening in young people's lives, how their decisions are being influenced, what impacts the decisions they make have. And also really always attending to the more kind of macro external picture of not just what CSC programs or providers can or ideally would be doing, but also thinking about the change that we need to see among employers, colleges and universities, et cetera. And some of that will kind of come out in the presentation. So that's me, and I will turn it over to maybe Howard next.
Hello, everyone. I'm Howard Goldman. I'm a professor of psychiatry at the University of Maryland School of Medicine, where I've been since 1985. I was trained in medicine and psychiatry, and then I went to graduate school in social welfare. And that's really, I think, what connected me for the last 40 years is providing advice to the disability program at Social Security from a number of different perspectives, and I won't go into that in much detail. But in addition to being very concerned on the one hand that people who deserved and needed benefits from Social Security, I've also been concerned that people not stay on the rolls if they would prefer to work. And so I've been quite involved in supported employment. More recently, I've gotten involved in early psychosis studies, including serving as a consultant to Tara Neendam's study of DUP with Cam Carter. I have other connections to Sacramento. My daughter dances as a principal dancer with the Sacramento Ballet for many years. And more recently, Nev has engaged me as a co-principal investigator on this study that you'll hear a little bit more about. So I'll turn it over to Shannon.
Thank you, Howard. My name is Shannon Pagdon. I know many of you. I'm a research coordinator. I come to this space with a background in peer support, which kind of informed a lot of my interests. I started out as a service user, similarly have a lot of passion in this area, and we'll go into my personal experience more in a bit around navigating disability work and school. I've grown up in California for most of my life. Very passionate about services here and increasing services here. And yeah, just very grateful and lucky to be collaborating with Nev and Howard in this project.
Just putting in the chat that also Howard and Shannon, not me, but Howard and Shannon will be doing, I think probably Stanford is the easiest, but if you are in the Bay Area and would be interested in, kind of hearing more about the research that we're doing, there will be a presentation at Stanford and I guess one at UCSF, and reach out to any one of us and we could connect you or loop you and get you more details.
Objectives for this training will be to be able to describe the challenges associated with SSI and SSDI and application decisions in early psychosis, and to articulate the complex impacts of early psychosis on vocational identity and connect these impacts to needed areas of support.
We'll jump in now. So we did change it a little bit. I realize the training material really focuses in more on the kind of supported education piece and specifically disability accommodations, which is certainly related to the big picture, which we'll talk about, but I had sort of forgotten, but between the interval that we put together learning objectives and the content. So just advance apologies for that. What we're gonna just kind of go through is sort of the importance of higher education and thinking about higher education in the context of the sort of kind of landscape of recovery and just sort of services and supports that we're offering to young adults. Just a little bit of background and a kind of reminder for maybe some of you on the intent of the ADA, and then kind of focusing on and thinking more, I think, creatively really about disability accommodations. In terms of who's in the room, so I'm assuming just sort of a mix of folks working in different roles within the early psychosis space. I just want to say up front, I think this is relevant to absolutely everyone. And then the interviews I've done, again, kind of focusing on this area for quite some time now, interviews that I've done with clients receiving CSC and just, kind of young adults with psych disabilities in general. I think there are a lot of gaps, and it's not always the case that a client might bring this up with a C, so like somebody in a dedicated supported education and employment role. It might be any member of the team. And so I think kind of this knowledge of both what the student might be able to advocate for and what the team, whichever member that is, can kind of support and encourage is really, really valuable. The materials I'll be drawing in, I put this back in the chat for people who joined later, are two toolkits that I developed, and actually Adriana Furuzawa from Felton. So this was while I was in California when I developed these toolkits, was involved. One is for families and students, and one is for basically faculty, staff, and administrators in higher education. There is a kind of a tie-in deliverable, kind of more of a brief that was for early psychosis providers, which we could add in an email, send out to you, but it's really kind of just making the case for CSC staff kind of being aware of these resources and really kind of engaging in advocacy that is more oriented to what it is that, whether it's, really kind of employment or education, that clients are experiencing in those settings, sort of, right, apart from the clinic or the program. So as many of you may already know, college graduation, and so there's different kinds of metrics. Have people ever attended college? Did they graduate from college? but the links between college graduation and a whole host of long-term life outcomes are really, really strong and have been replicated hundreds of times. So across quality of life, lifetime earnings, physical health and mortality, job satisfaction, life expectancy. And these are just kind of some of the areas. Marriage or partnership is really influenced by college graduation, et cetera. We know because of the student debt crisis in part that there are, some more kind of questionable findings or findings that start to raise questions in our mind about counterintuitive consequences of college graduation, including debt. But just in terms of the last 30, 40 years of research, consistent kind of findings that college graduation really kind of improves people's finances, quality of life, et cetera. Some of the benefits of higher education. So there is, of course, emerging with a college degree and being able to apply for jobs that require having a bachelor's degree or maybe even a bachelor's degree in something specific. An undergraduate degree is obviously a gatekeeper to a master's degree or kind of even further education professionally. So there's that role, right? But there's also kind of what tends to happen in college environments. So young people are exposed to, or students, and I really should stop saying young people, because when it comes to higher education in the United States, the average age of an undergraduate student now is something like the late 30s. So we're not just talking about young adults, actually. But that environment exposes students who are matriculating to all these different fields and professions and possibilities. And not only through majors and coursework and internship opportunities, but because you're in a very socially intense space where you're meeting all kinds of people from all over the state, from all over the world. You're just hearing about a lot of things that if you go straight from high school, say, into a retail service job or manufacturing or janitorial work, which are things that are not uncommon to see among CSC clients, you're not getting the same level of exposure to people and hearing about things that it turns out might interest you to do in life. And then specifically internships, practicums, and other types of field learning experiences, which are common and increasingly common in college campuses and kind of post-secondary programs. They're this really kind of low risk way in which students can kind of test out different things. And I say all this because I think in interviewing a very large number over the years, or working with in some capacity CSC clients, often what I hear is that people haven't had a whole lot of exposure to different career possibilities. And especially clients coming from more disadvantaged, high poverty backgrounds. And so, kind of really thinking about, it's not just like in the moment, one might ask somebody, and it's like this very narrow range of careers or jobs or something, because that's what they've seen people in their immediate social network do. And worry about, well, like, what if you keep thinking, like, what if you'd really been exposed to all these different things and, and might be kind of able to think more expansively about your own future and the range of things that you could be doing or working towards. Just a relationship slide. So all of this is sort of kind of grounded in research, right? But how higher education has been linked to job satisfaction specifically, because again, young people can certainly get jobs, right, without a college degree. But, kind of looking at job satisfaction specifically, we see some of the different mechanisms by which college graduation increases job satisfaction. So wages being higher, right? That's sort of very well established, unless you're a creative, right? And you're like you become a famous actor, a musician, or, there are ways that you can get to a very satisfying job, but just sort of general, right? What's referred to in this literature is interest congruence. So really being able to work in the areas or on the topics that you are personally most interested in and passionate about. Typically having an undergraduate degree helps tremendously with it, opens up the range of positions, and often that college degree is tied to the work that somebody wants to do. Job security. So very kind of low wage entry level jobs tend to be much less secure, sometimes, you know, part-time, contingent, not carrying benefits. We can also think here about just sort of, you know, kind of increasingly kind of common gig economy type positions that people may have that really have no kind of career mobility built into them, no long-term job security in the sense of like retirement or benefits or anything like that. Flexibility of working conditions. So this could be a little bit different if we were thinking about the gig economy, but there's all the sort of downsides of working in those kind of contingent contract labor kind of positions. But compared to your average, say you're working in an Amazon delivery plant, like, you know, like back in the warehouse, right, which is where a lot of the positions are for kind of line staff in the Amazon world, is really not very flexible. You're having to clock in and clock out. You're often having to perform some degree of physical labor or standing up, also in retail environments. Whereas in many ways, an office job, or certainly I'm a faculty member, I have all this flexibility. I can work from home, I can go into the office, I can pursue my passion projects, right? Like I really have a lot more flexibility than if I go back in time I did when I was working, like, you know, kind of low wage jobs as a young adult. And then kind of organizational support for career development is a big thing, and as well as organizational support in the sense of supported supervision. So we tend to see much higher perceived organizational support in positions and jobs that are connected to, you know, that require a college degree, and in turn that influences and increases job satisfaction. So just sort of making the case for, you know, for higher ed. Barriers to higher ed are really kind of multifaceted, right? So symptoms themselves, but I think a lot of the time, people become so demoralized by whether it's really symptoms or it's just sort of the sum total of everything that's happening, that self-esteem, and particularly in vocational contexts, what gets, you know, kind of referred to as vocational self-efficacy, can just really plummet. And it can be very, you know, become a very hard to even then tease things out, right? So if you're depressed, you're hearing voices that are telling you you're worthless, you're feeling more and more worthless, you've been given a diagnosis like, let's say, schizophrenia spectrum, that there are, you know, endless negative stereotypes about, and then you Google schizophrenia and you see that it's associated with all these like horrible sounding cognitive deficits. And you're really just starting to think and convince yourself that your life is over, that like, how the heck are you ever going to do anything? You may be then in fact experiencing stigma and discrimination, and or anticipating it, or, you know, most often a combination. And so, you know, you experience discrimination in one setting, you start to expect it. And so now you're acting in ways that try to sort of head off that discrimination or stigma, which could be avoidance, right? You're just avoiding, you're shutting down, you're not opening up about things. So all kinds of just defensive mechanisms to sort of protect oneself against what one thinks one might be subject to or has. And so I think there's a lot there that isn't just sort of discrete symptoms, but is about understanding the sort of impact of the diagnosis, the way it's talked about, the things that you will find on the internet, when invariably, I think anybody, nowadays, any young person is going to Google what they're diagnosed with, right? Is very negative messaging. And so just kind of internalizing that. And so picking those things apart is really, really hard. And a lot of that really kind of starts to shape people's identities and their confidence in the future. And then in the non-disability category, finances, right? So again, first gen clients from low SES backgrounds are going to be at a huge disadvantage because of the costs associated with a college education in the United States. Lack of family or social support. So let's say we're talking about kind of clients who have been through the foster care system, aren't in touch with their birth families, were never, adopted. They're, very, very, very kind of precariously situated in terms of social networks. And then educational barriers and inequalities of other kinds that might have preceded psychosis onset. So we know the public education system in the United States is just incredibly unequal, right? So what zip code you live in really determines the quality of your education to a large extent. And so kind of folks who have already kind of grown up very disadvantaged in terms of quality of education, overcrowded schools, kind of violence in schools, carceral environments in schools, because there's an expectation of violence, really, really kind of different, and obviously not conducive to sort of an easy pathway into post-secondary education. And this is not meant to be exhaustive, but these are just some.
I would just add that I think it's also common for folks to just be heavily discouraged at all from seeking higher education or work. I know I was heavily discouraged from seeking higher education or work when I was diagnosed, and I think that kind of ties into all of these ideas as well. And hopefully that is changing. And I think that is less of an issue in CSE, but I think it is still common for a lot of folks, I hear at least, that are kind of actively told that it's not a good idea and they should not pursue something like that. So that would be my only issue.
Thanks, Shannon. Okay, moving on to the intent of the ADA. Along the lines of what Shannon said, just to emphasize this, in the most recent project I did interviewing CSC clients about their experiences, and this is in really good programs, really well implemented CSC, including in California. A lot of people did feel like they were being discouraged. So even in the today, and I think some of that is a protective impulse on the part of providers. So it's not like coming from a "we want to disempower you" place. I mean, sometimes it is, right? But I think for the most part, it's, and the same thing for families, it's trying to protect young people from what the family or the provider starts to worry is not going to work out. So just to say to emphasize, it's really a thing. It's not something that we have kind of left behind and now we're just all recovery oriented, because I think it tends to be a much more kind of nuanced set of dynamics than that, and things that providers and family end up saying, and ways in which people end up feeling discouraged. So I'm not going to kind of read through this entirely. I'll just read through these middle sections, because what I want to emphasize to you, I think, is that the intent of the ADA was really quite robust and emancipatory, and that is not how implementation has played out. But for lawyers and advocates, right, kind of going back to the ADA itself is valuable and helpful under many circumstances. So, really the claims were, so this is straight from the Act: discrimination against individuals with disabilities persists in such critical areas as employment, housing, public accommodation, education, etc. Unlike individuals who have experienced discrimination on the basis of race, color, sex, national origin, religion, or age, individuals who have experienced discrimination on the basis of disability have often had no legal recourse to redress such discrimination. Individuals with disabilities continually encounter various forms of discrimination, including outright intentional exclusion, the discriminatory effects of architectural, transportation, and communication barriers, overprotective rules and policies, failure to make modifications to existing practices, exclusionary qualification standards and criteria, segregation, and relegation to lesser services, programs, activities, benefits, jobs, or other opportunities. Census data, national polls, and other studies have documented that people with disabilities as a group occupy an inferior status in our society and are severely disadvantaged socially, vocationally, economically, and educationally. And then the ADA goes on to, of course, outline a plan for this is what we are trying to end. Right. And so again, it's just kind of, I think it's very helpful to remind oneself of this intent, which has been incredibly watered down through implementation, judicial decisions that have been very conservative, that have reinterpreted really the ADA in a very conservative way. And then, you know, in the vocational context, we're most centrally focused on here, educational institutions and employers who honestly do not want to do anything beyond what they think is the sort of the minimal legal actions required to stay in compliance with the ADA. So there's a real kind of lack of will beyond really taking the ADA and saying, we're going to really change things in this country for folks who are disabled. So I think I said most of this. And I would just add to it, last bullet point here, unequal application to mental versus physical disabilities, which is very well documented and plays out across almost every aspect of how judges have ruled on the ADA, and the absolutely lowest likelihood of succeeding with an ADA-based claim is folks with psychiatric disabilities specifically. And a lot of that is honestly judges themselves not believing that the disabilities in question are real, right? So very much this sort of entrenched, just pull yourself up by the bootstraps. It's not real if I can't see it, right? I can see that you're in a wheelchair. I can see that the barrier is real, and the invisible barriers, kind of that come into play with psych disabilities, really generating all of this sort of skepticism and like disability con thinking on the part of judges, and also often administrators and employers.
Now, there's also the problem of having to disclose that you have a disability.
Right.
So even before you get dismissed or handled with the lowest possible accommodation available, many people don't ever get to that stage because they're very afraid to disclose and evoke the longstanding prejudices and discriminatory practices in workplaces.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, one of the last project I did, which was specifically asking CSC clients about their work and school related experiences, honestly, there was more disclosure on the educational side because in a way it's separated out from the individual, so that like the student could go to the disability office and not have to actually tell their professor. They could make a decision about whether they want the disability office to send the sort of generic letter to a professor or not. So it's sort of, there's more separation, whereas it was almost a zero rate I encountered of disclosure to employers. Because, the young people I interviewed just so wary of what the consequences would be and the stigma, and therefore they aren't accessing employer side accommodations at all. And I don't know how widespread that would be. Again, this is part of the motivation behind the research project we're doing, which, again, is really going to focus on understanding the experiences of early psychosis clients across the country. And we really want to know how big of a problem some of these issues are and start to think about what we can do about it. So we do need more research to really understand how often this is happening and how it ends up kind of impacting people's kind of longer term career trajectories. And another thing I've heard a lot is clients getting fired and just accepting it, right? Like they're hospitalized and they're just fired because the employer doesn't know why they were suddenly gone. And rather than even sort of tell them why, they just sort of accept job loss. So I think, the ripple effects of these sort of decisions and sort of stigma as it manifests or as it is projected or expected or anticipated, it can be really significant. So the toolkits, which again, the full text of them is just over in the chat, or the links to the full text versions of both. There's a lot in them, but I think in my mind, the two highlights and probably the two things I was most excited about accomplishing through this process were really kind of detailed sections on accommodations, which was what I'm going to go through next, as well as a very extensive legal troubleshooting guide. And I worked on that with Karen Bauer, who is one of the actually top attorneys in the country, experts on campus mental health law. She was the former Bazelon Center for Mental Health Law lead over campus mental health, and then kind of went on. She's been the chair of the board of the Jed Foundation, et cetera. And lawyers don't like to weigh in on detailed questions, in my experience. And I had to really, really push her. I was like, people don't have the resources to go to a lawyer. If they did, that would be great to be like, well, it's too fuzzy. I don't want to kind of put guidance that could be misinterpreted on a page. So I sort of pushed her as much as I could to really kind of issue legal guidance on a pretty long series of kind of questions, and all of those kind of stemming from stuff that I think I have frequently encountered in the early psychosis space. What do you do? What do you do type questions? What do you do if you're placed on an involuntary leave? What do you do if you're summoned for a disciplinary hearing? What are the immediate things that you can do to try to protect yourself and triage? What is and isn't legal? How do you understand what is and isn't legal? Who can disclose to who? Which is really quite complicated because of sort of the patchwork way in which HIPAA, FERPA, depending on the student's status and whether they're employed and whether they're in treatment or not. So it's actually really, really complicated, much more complicated than just a mental health agency or clinic, where HIPAA is the law that's really kind of governing privacy and disclosures. So anyway, so all that's in there, but what I wanted to talk about was the accommodations piece. And so just as a reminder for some of you, this may be newer because it's not your area, what the ADA allows for is reasonable modifications to policies, procedures, and requirements, so long as they do not, quote, fundamentally alter an essential feature of the course of study or pose undue hardship on the institution. And Karen, plain language operationalizes fundamentally alter essential feature as skills, knowledge, principles, and/or concepts that a student must master. And that is subjective. So I'm now a faculty member. I teach. I both navigate these situations all the time in terms of my own students, but also I'm sort of like the point person in my school. And so I can tell you it is in fact very, 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 very subjective. In terms of what is and is not essential, and instructors for the same course can rather easily make those determinations in a really different way. So something to keep in mind. Some key points: per the ADA, modifications must be individualized. the most common thing that one will see is that this list of accommodations is handed to students when they get into the disability office. And that's fine. Nothing prohibits a university from saying, here are accommodations we commonly offer. Students cannot be limited to those accommodations. And I think even in working with supported education and employment staff, often there's not really an understanding that those are typically the tip of the iceberg in terms of what a student, especially with kind of ongoing experiences of psychosis that are more distressing and may need. In general, as a general rule, and like Karen, the attorney, right, would agree with this, advocacy is often required because there's so little understanding on the part of disability office staff. If you just sort of say, can I have this? And they say no, and the conversation ends there, you're going to end up with an incredibly kind of limited set of accommodations typically, and that are going to be usually nowhere near robust enough to really kind of help a student with more significant kind of ongoing psychosis. ADA provides limited protection when a university or other entity alleges that a student has violated codes of conduct or engaged in misconduct in some form. So I just want to acknowledge that this is one of the trickiest places, and it's very common, right? So a student experiencing early psychosis or a relapse or something, right, walks naked across campus or engages in something that looks like plagiarism for maybe wildly different reasons, right? Because they, maybe even kind of thought like that they're this great scientist, and so they submitted their paper as their own. So I see this all the time and just want to flag it because I think it's an area in which CSC programs would want to be super vigilant. The protections are limited. Really, for the most part, probably like, lawyers or legal advocates should be involved to try to triage, especially if the charges or allegations are serious. And I worked with a student not that long ago who had her entire bachelor's degree and master's rescinded by the university. And I won't go into all the details of that story, but essentially because of psychosis. And so the consequences can be really serious if the university is able to make the case or is making the case that, their policies have been violated, even if it's not rising to the level of like criminal charges, right? So there's just, universities tend to have a hefty set of policies and sometimes, again, kind of significant punitive actions when they're violated. Administrative accommodations. So administrative accommodations are an area I think like kind of often people aren't even aware that yes, that there's nothing in the ADA that limits accommodations or modifications to courses, to coursework, or to internships or something. So there's a lot of possibility for what could be requested on the administrative side. And I just want to quickly, I'm going to leave some time. I know I'm taking longer for questions, but I just want to kind of emphasize early registration for courses, changing a course to pass fail even after the switching deadline has passed, counting a part-time course load as full-time for financial aid and administrative purposes. And Karen assured me that she has actually successfully advocated for that for students. A course refund even after the refund deadline has passed. And I feel like these are things that almost nobody knows, because I hear from students all the time that they had no assistance with these kinds of accommodations. And so they just have been subject to whatever sort of generally kind of punitive policies are in place. Academic advising, permission to request a specific advisor, faculty mentor, or project supervisor in cases where other students cannot. So it actually would be legal if somebody said, I know Nev, or I know Dr. Jones has a disability and is really a great advocate for students with disabilities. I want her to be my assigned advisor rather than this other person. That is a totally legitimate request to make under the ADA. Permission to request a particular placement. So if we were talking about social work students, under the ADA, then they can make a claim for a particular kind of internship or practicum, even when other students can't. And then permission to require information and communications in a particular format. So requiring or, requesting written communications always around advising, for example, even if that's not necessarily kind of standard in the program or for that advisor. And permission for a friend, family member, or other ally to accompany the student to any meeting, even in which such an individual would not typically be allowed. And the same thing, by the way, holds on the employment side. So, anybody can request that an advocate be present with them. And I literally just yesterday got an email from a CSC, Supported Education and Employment specialist, who experienced one of his clients was hospitalized, and the employer is basically saying they're going to fire him. And so he was wondering, like what can I do? So for one thing, you can communicate all of that information. You can say that there's a disability, that somebody is hospitalized. The employer may not be able to acknowledge it, but they can certainly receive it. And then as soon as the client is able, they can meet with the employer together with a member of the CSC team, the Cs in this case, right? And really kind of raise issues around ADA potential discrimination. So it's like very hard for people to self-advocate, especially if they've maybe just been discharged from the hospital or something. So it's absolutely above board and common to request that somebody be present with you. So internships and practica, residential services, kind of same principles, preferential placement, early registration. Preferential access to a private dorm room is something that Karen has successfully argued for clients under the ADA. And then just briefly moving to disciplinary processes. So it's limited. It is much more limited. Here, the ADA is not ideal when it comes to psych disabilities or sort of mental disabilities in general. But disability can be considered as a mitigating factor in disciplinary processes. An ally or advocate can again be requested their presence in any and all meetings, whether they're virtual, in person. There can be a request made that a third party is copied into all email correspondence. Accommodations can then be built into a disciplinary corrections plan. And the student can request, which has the dual purpose, like in fact, right, of serving as documentation, and helping them process it, that communications about disciplinary hearings, actions, or follow-ups must be provided in writing. And often institutions and employers try to avoid doing that, right? Because they have to be extremely careful if something is in writing versus if they're just saying it in an oral meeting. So this really sort of can serve a double function, and again, can be requested under the ADA. As long as it can just be justified in terms of the individual's particular kind of disability. I guess we should briefly just to reiterate. So we're doing a large study, as I've mentioned, on how young adults in the context of CSC are navigating work, school, but also decisions about like SSI or SSDI. We really are doing this, I think, to really try to kind of change things and improve things. So we want to understand what the problems and the barriers are from a very expansive perspective, where some of that might be internalized low self-expectations, demoralization. Some of it is barriers that we know affect folks, again, from different groups, different ethno-racial backgrounds. Young people who have been subject to a lot of structural racism. So there's not, there's no equity in terms of how young people are affected by, by a lot of what goes on. And we really, really want to understand that. And so that we're in a better position as a field to really kind of take those next steps and like really kind of figure out a more kind of robust set of policy, practice, and potentially additional research. steps for moving forward. And UC Davis is directly involved, and Stefania, who's here on the meeting as a co-investigator, and you all will be hearing about the project probably in other ways. So we're going to kind of communicate, I think, to teams in a variety of ways, but this was one strategy for sort of getting the issues on your radars, and then just sort of saying, and we are trying to really understand this and really understand how diverse young adults in these programs are being impacted and navigating the issues. So if you're interested, reach out to us. We'll send out the flyers, which has all our contact information on it.
Yeah, it's probably worth saying that our project is connected to EPINET and to EPI-CAL in particular. So we're recruiting from programs that have hubs in the EPINET program in Texas, in Maryland, where I'm on the faculty, and in California and New York State, because Lisa Dixon is also a co-principal investigator.